What if I told you the first time I trusted my gut was as a freshman in high school in the middle of a Sephora? Welcome to the Trust Your Gut podcast. You know, we live in a world that runs on mostly logic and reason, but I'm here to provide you a roadmap to life using the most ancient and arguably underrated form of wisdom, your gut. This podcast explores all you need to know on how to harness your own intuition through life's highs and inevitable lows. From relationships to parenting, to wealth management and career shifts, I'll walk alongside you to better understand how to lean into your own intuition for guidance and support. My name is Dr. Alaina Puff, school psychologist turned intuitive coach, and I'll be guiding you through this adventure as I share my personal and professional experiences on how I learned to tap into my own intuition and how this changed my life forever. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Trust Your Gut podcast. My name is Dr. Alaina Puff, and I am so excited for today's episode. I have a very special guest joining me to talk about all things birth, motherhood, and I am just so happy to be here. I have Alex Barr here. Hi, Alex. Thanks for joining us. Yay, I'm so happy you're here.
Excited to be here.
Yes. So a little bit about Alex before we jump into it is Alex is a Phoenix-based birth advocate and doula. And her mission is really about disrupting the negative narrative around birth. She works to empower pregnant people to trust their intuition. I love that. And advocate for a positive and informed pregnancy and postpartum. And I know for me and the circles that I've been running in, this is a conversation that keeps coming up over and over again about mamas and families who are either expanding or growing their family or going through the process for the first time. And I think, Alex, having you on here is going to be such a beautiful opportunity to answer and debunk some of the myths that are floating around out there and really provide an alternative perspective on what this process could look like for you and your family. So thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with us today.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk and share all the things about birth and, like you said, parenting and all of that really cool stuff.
Yes, amazing. Okay, so let's go ahead and just jump into it. Can you share with our listeners a little bit about what prompted you to get into this line of work?
Yeah, of course. So I got pregnant with my son in 2019, and it was a very tough experience. I had a physically very healthy pregnancy, thank goodness, but it was full of so many, first of all, like shifts in who I was as a person. Mm-hmm. First of all, such a big shift from not being a parent into that realm. But then I also just kept running into a lot of situations where I wasn't being heard. I was kind of being disrespected by medical providers. I was not like in my power at all. And I was seeing a traditional OBGYN. I was doing kind of the traditional hospital route. And I stumbled across some people on social media talking about their experiences with midwifery, and especially plus size people with their experience with midwifery. And I said, okay, this is what I need, and decided to switch my care into like a midwifery practice. And it showed me a different way to give birth, a different way to view pregnancy, a more holistic lens, of course. And then once I had my son, I really was just so amazed at the difference between the two sides of the experience that I knew that I wanted to walk with families with like going through that experience, going through that like scary time where people are just like shouting scary things at you and not supporting you, not listening to you, not respecting you as a full person. And I was like, that's it. That's what I have to do.
Oh my gosh.
And, so I took a training, I went to a birth, and the first birth I went to was beautiful and it was amazing. But the second and the third births I went to were crazy whirlwinds. And I was like driving home really like, can I do this? Like, is this something that I really want to do? And, then I like I took a nap, I ate some food, right? I like recovered from that birth.
Right.
Anybody who goes to births, they're really exhausting. And I woke up like, no, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. And since then have just been going on and on. So that was in 2020. So now we're here 4.5 years later. And then about like 2021, I also was seeing like a real trend of not enough education around birth, right? So we live in a culture now where most people aren't seeing births until they're seeing their own, right?
Right.
Whereas, in the past, that wasn't the case, right? There was always going to be a lot of people around who knew about birth and had seen them and experienced them and could share their wisdom and their knowledge with you. And we don't have that anymore. So I was just seeing this huge lack of education and even understanding of like, okay, you have lots of choices, right? Like, how do we decide which one's right for you?
Right.
So education just kind of flowed nicely as an addition. And then I kind of found my love for that there. So that I'm still a birth doula. I still take birth clients, but my focus has been on the education side for the past 2 years.
Beautiful. What an amazing story. I mean, just listening to you talk about the origin of going through that experience from the patient side of things, and how your perception of being mishandled or mistreated through that system and creating a different pathway for yourself, like having the courage to do that, but then not only going through that and successfully giving birth to your son and starting your family, but now helping usher other women through that same birthing portal is just, it's so powerful, Alex. So thank you. Thank you for your work and thank you for sharing with us.
Powerful, and it's really like an honor. Like anytime someone invites me into that space or wants to learn from me, I'm just so like honored's the best word. I'm just so in awe of like, yes, I will be there, and I'm so like grateful that I'm invited in those spaces every single time.
Wow, that's amazing.
And I've never seen a baby born that I didn't like cry like a baby in the corner.
Honestly, same. I mean, even in movies, I find myself crying in those moments. And so I kind of want to take a step back and I want to talk about your experiences in the modern medical system, because I think that societally, we still live in this normative culture that you give birth in a hospital. I mean, it's still where the gross majority of folks are delivering and, facilitating their prenatal care through. And so I'm curious if you could share in a little more detail kind of some of the red flags that you experienced during that prenatal journey when you were still very much doing more of a traditional birthing style, to help our listeners plug into maybe some experiences that they might be pushing up against.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, the medical system isn't great to anybody. It's especially not great to women, right? It's highly documented, even worse for women of color, right? That we're not heard, we're not listened to, we're not respected, we're pushed off quite a bit. And then my personal experience, I also added it being a plus size person into that. And there's even more like nonsense and myths and really just bias that was coming up. But we really have a culture in general where we listen to doctors kind of blindly, right? That's kind of they're in a power position. They tell us something and we listen, right? And that is okay if that's what people want to do. But I personally have seen it firsthand with myself, with my family, with other people I've seen, where important things are missed and important things are ignored, right? And so people get sicker or they get hurt because they're not being listened to by providers. And when I went into my first appointment with an OB, that is exactly what happened. Is I was not listened to. All negativity was spewed at me, right? And I just remember thinking like, this is supposed to be a good thing. I'm so happy that I get to bring a child into the world,
right? And
I'm already not being heard, right? So, and that just kind of built up on it every appointment, right? I didn't feel like I was being listened to. I felt like I was being rushed. I felt like it would be like, hey, how are you? Everything's good. Okay, bye. That's normal. See you later, right? Like, everything just brushed off, nothing explained. There was very little education on anything. And most importantly, nothing was presented to me as an option, right? So certain tests and ultrasounds and all these things, all of them are optional, right? And most people don't know that. But none of them were explained to me of like, if you would like it, here's the benefits, here are the risks of it, you know, and then it's up to you. That was never
Right.
presented that way. It was
Wow.
like, this is the next thing and this is what you're going to do and schedule your appointment. Right. And so the more, you know, I had an ultrasound where the ultrasound tech was not very kind to me. And I left. They didn't get the reading that they were supposed to get. And they were like, okay, well, now you have to reschedule for another time because, you know, baby wouldn't flip and we couldn't see this thing we were, you know, testing for. And I just was sitting in my car of like, I don't want to do that again. I don't want to do that again.
Yeah.
So I'm like Googling what this test was and if it was optional. It's 100% optional. I didn't have to do it. And I was like, so I didn't have to do it, but they want me to do it again. And then, you know, I didn't have the best insurance. So then I'm paying for it again. Right. And so I just was like, okay, there's got to be something different. And that was kind of like the final straw for me of like, okay, I'm finding somewhere else. I'm going to find somewhere that respects me a little bit more and respects what I'm doing. Right. And the thing with, a lot of people forget about in pregnancy is and in life, but yes, physical health is important. Your mental health is so important. The amount of stress that you're putting on your body, on your baby, right, it should absolutely come into, and like we should care about that, right? So if we're going into the situation where every appointment and every interaction is negative and stressful and overwhelming, that's going to have an impact on your pregnancy, on your baby, right? So minimizing that or lessening that as much as possible is something that I really talk to people a lot about, of like some things, the stress is not worth it.
Right. Oh, that's so powerful. And, you know, I'm so sorry to hear that you had that experience. You're not the first person in my circle who has shared about that. And it like my blood boils. And, you know, I just think even my most recent like wellness check that I go to the doctor for, and like you're just another like, tick in their day, another appointment to fill the schedule. And there's a lack of personalization there, and there's a lack of connection in that system that I would imagine being in the vulnerable place of carrying a child in your body for the first time, being in this place of extreme vulnerability. It's not like you knew what you were doing. You hadn't had that experience before. And then this person who's in a position of power kind of strong arming you through the process. I could only imagine how overwhelming and defeating that probably felt in those early stages of your pregnancy.
Yeah. And so that's something that I really like emphasize a lot to my clients, and that is one of the parts of, you know, teaching advocacy, teaching that only you know the right answer, and only your intuition is going to tell you what the right thing to do is, because it's going to be different for every person. Teaching that has been such a big key in like everything that I do, because it helps give that power back, and it helps give you like, okay, actually I'm in control and I'm at the center of this, and I get to make those decisions for my body, for my baby, for my family. And that's like a big part of what I'm always reminding my clients and my students of like, oh no, this is yours. You're in the driver's seat, right?
It's beautiful. Let's speak a little bit more to that. So I imagine sharing that to people who maybe this is their first time, their first pregnancy, first time going through that process. I would imagine there would be some pushback there of like, well, I don't know what the heck I'm doing. My body's changing. My hormones are fluctuating. You even mentioned already earlier in the episode about this loss of identity. I mean, I think as a society, we underestimate the potency of going through the pregnancy process. I mean, because it's multifaceted in so many ways. It's not just that you're growing a human inside of you. There's so many other aspects that are simultaneously running at the same time as you growing a human inside of you. And I think a lot of that gets lost. And so how do you coach people going through this process who might say, well, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know, I don't know if my intuition is guiding me because I never have been here before.
I always start that process with education, right? Yes, you probably don't know all the things that could happen or that are going on, right? But I can give you this foundation of education. I can explain to you what this test is, or what the what's going on in your body and why you're feeling these certain ways, right? And so I teach of like kind of how to work through that. So one of the acronyms we teach is called BRAIN, right? So this is how we make decisions. What are the benefits? What are the risks? What are the alternatives, right? What is my intuition telling me? And what if I do nothing, right? So these are things I could research. These are things I could ask my provider, right, to get that information. And then essentially we're compiling that to make that decision, right?
Beautiful.
That way I know kind of the base of like what this thing is and why people are testing for it. But maybe there are some risks for it. Maybe there are some benefits, right? Maybe there are alternatives. And then I have to ask myself, right? And so that's something that we talk a lot about in our classes, is just there is no right answer for me that's right for me that's going to be right for you. And there might be a certain situation that I would say yes to something that I never thought I was going to say yes to, right? So that's where the intuition comes in. I cannot tell you how your pregnancy is going to go. I cannot tell you how your birth is going to go. Even if you've had births before, this one's probably going to be different, right? Like it is such a, like, you literally have no idea which way it's going. And I've seen birth go so many different ways. It is mind-boggling, and that is what's hard for people sometimes to wrap their mind around it. So that's where that intuition comes in to be so important. So I really encourage people, like, what are we doing for our mental health? Are we talking to a therapist? Are we meditating? Are we moving our body intuitively? Are we journaling, right? Like whatever that looks like for that person, of how we can be in touch with ourselves and answer those questions, because it is hard. It is not easy. It is hard. But the thing with choices, and especially in pregnancy and in the medical system in general, if I don't make that choice, someone else is making that for me. And that's the key, right? It can be really easy to be like, I don't know what the right thing is, right? If I decline to make that decision, somebody else is going to make it for me.
Yeah.
And that feels worse to me than figuring out my intuition and figuring out how to decide and then making that decision.
Yeah. No, it makes total sense. I envision you as like the fairy godmother walking alongside these mamas as they're moving through this journey. And it just makes me, I like just can't stop smiling thinking about it, because, you know, it's such an overwhelming process at times. And when you speak about intuition, you know, with that being the cornerstone of my own practice, you know, I always talk about the difference between intuition and control. And a lot of the times when we feel out of control, it actually blocks our intuition, because like our conscious brain is trying to be like, well, I need to do this and this and this, and like plan out concrete steps. But when we relinquish that control paradigm, that we need to do everything right and how our friends are doing it or whatever it may be, comparison, et cetera, that no one knows what's better for your journey than you, right? No one has a...
And I will say that that is the hardest part for parents to wrap their heads around.
Why is that?
Is that they're like, they'll get the education and they're like, now what else can I do? And I'm like, this is it. The rest of you're doing everything you can. You've educated yourself. You have the birth plan. You have the nursery ready. Whatever is on your list, you have it. Everything else you have to let go of. You have to just see what happens. There's, you know, I run into a lot of families who have a lot of questions that I don't have the answers to, right? And so that is really hard to give up that idea of control. I think even in medicine, people really think like, there's one way this can go, and this is the plan, and this is how it'll work. Birth isn't like that, right? Birth just like, it really asks you to like give up all of that control and really relinquish yourself to birth and whatever that is, right? You know, this is where people who believe in a higher power will give it up to that, right? For people who don't, we just have to like go along for the ride kind of thing.
I mean, yes. And I think that's what's so powerful about this experience when people go through it, or even if you don't go through it personally, being near somebody who goes through it, because there's a surrendering. And so there's a surrendering that is required. Like as much as you want to like concretely plan out how things are going to go, to your point, there's no way to predict that. And so part of the process that I, even in my work with expecting mamas and their families, like there's a point where they have to surrender that to something. Like I can't see the end, but I have to trust in the process, which is essentially the medicine for intuition in and of itself. And so with that, I want to speak to the birth portal. And for listeners who are not familiar with the concept of a birth portal, this is a really cool concept that I think, Alex, you spend most of your time kind of discussing with your clients. And so can you speak to either your personal journey with that, of going through that portal, or professionally how you set these mamas up to kind of ascend through that?
This is one of the things that is hard to talk about because it really is, unless you've done it, you're like, you don't know, right?
Yeah, right.
It is a really cool thing to experience. It's an even cooler thing to witness as someone else go through it. But the birth portal is exactly what it sounds like. When we're giving birth, we're in this really cool in between, life and death, and we're seeing this experience, and we're bringing life into the world. We get to hear someone's voice for the very first time, right? Mm-hmm. It gives me chills every time, right?
Me too.
Yeah. And so, again, it is something that we have to just give up. We have to give up to and see what happens, right? Having support, and there's things we can do to prepare, but we have to give into it. We just have to surrender and give into that experience, regardless of what that experience looks like, right? Because it can look at in all these different ways. But yeah, I have a hard time with that one because I'm like, once you've gone through it, you'll know.
Yeah, it's a club.
Right? And, it's like, it's very cliche, but, you're birthing your child. You're also birthing yourself as a parent, right? And that is such a cool thing to go through, but it's jarring. It's like, holy cow, like it will blow you away. It'll like, you're a new person, right? And that is really difficult. And that's where, the giving up the element of control and things like that is great for birth. It's going to come up again and again as a parent. The giving up control, the listening to your intuition, deciding what's right for you, like you're going to use that a lot. And that's what I tell people in class of like, this is your preparation for parenting,
yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
The things going totally different than you planned, and not being able to control everything, and not being just able to, when it's yourself, it's a lot easier to like decide what to do. When it's another person, it's a whole other ballgame.
100%. I almost view it as an initiation of sorts. Like the birthing portal is an initiation into parenthood, which is like, as you mentioned, this iteration of surrendering control, putting it up to something bigger than yourself that you're going to have to do, for the next 18 plus years or till the day you die. Right. And so I think that, I was just on a call this morning and we were talking about how our children are our greatest sources of healing, because they reflect all our deepest wounds, our greatest joys. And so really that initiation into that starts when that child is coming earthside, to enter the world. And I can only imagine, to bear witness to that, what a privilege that must be. One of my questions for you, and this is something that I actually has come up for me personally and professionally many times, is when maybe you could educate our listeners about some common options. Let's say the hospital route isn't jiving with you. You're looking for something in between, or could you share a little bit about some options that you often recommend, that are just available out there so that people can research that on their own? And with that, maybe some pros and cons.
Yeah, of course. So when we're talking about where to birth, first we want to talk about who do we want to be at our birth, right? Who do we want our medical provider to be? So if we decide to go the traditional route with an OB/GYN, we're only going to be in the hospital. That's kind of our only choice to have an OB. OBs are medical professionals. They're great. especially if we have any high risk things, any other medical issues going on, that kind of thing. That's where they're going to be the best. Then we can choose midwives. So we have midwives who operate in the hospital, which is great. We also have midwives who operate for home births or birth center births. So midwives in general have a different model of care than physicians do,
Okay.
right? So the midwifery model of care is more holistic. It's more, viewing someone as a whole person. Midwifery appointments are usually longer. They're more in depth, right? You see your midwife more. And you're going to really be able to walk through them a little bit more. Walk through birth with them more than you would like a physician. And then our out-of-hospital options, birth centers and home births, those are really great for low-risk people. So if we don't have any high risk factors and things like that, that's where that's going to be a really great option for you. Their rates of C-sections and rates of transfers and rates of everything are a lot lower out of hospital, right? So even like infant mortality is lower, and all of these things come into play where it can be safer for people to birth out of the hospital. And in other countries, midwifery is built in, right? So in other countries, a lot of European countries, when the first person you see when you're pregnant is a midwife, right? Maybe that's in the hospital, maybe that's out of the hospital, but that's the first person you're seeing. And OBGYN's a surgeon, right? Which is great when you need surgery, right?
Right.
But it's not always what we need, right? In the first appointment, right? So there are lots of options. There's lots of choices. There's also an option where people will, they call it free birthing or unassisted birthing, where they give birth without a medical provider, and that's an option as well. And essentially just involves a lot of education and taking some of that experience into your own hands, and that can be really cool to witness as well.
Wow. So there is definitely a spectrum of options available to expecting moms and families. And it sounds like, what was coming up when you were sharing that was even the ancestral lineage of giving birth, right? So like if we think back to hundreds of years ago, when a woman was expecting in a village or community, it really was a congregation of other women who came together to help support her through that. And how far we've come since then, as far as like a lot of this is done in isolation of your community. Like you go to the hospital and you come back with a baby. And so one of the biggest pushbacks I've heard for doing more holistic or alternative deliveries is a fear that comes up around what if something goes wrong and we're not in the hospital. Can you speak directly to that fear of why people might just be, reserved to be able to pursue those other options because they're not in the safest place possible?
Yeah. So I usually answer this question in two parts. And the first part is I really encourage people to do a lot of research. So I would love for some people, their gut instinct is to say, like, that's not safe. That's scary, right? Look up the cesarean rates, the mortality rates, all of these things that are associated with home birth and birth center birth, especially with ones who are attended by licensed midwives, right? Because sometimes there's confusion when people are not licensed. So first, I encourage people to do that, right? Because sometimes we're reacting in that, like, very emotional, like, oh no, this is scary, right? And then the second thing I say is that hospitals can be safe. Hospitals can also create problems, right? And birth is one of the things that we have over-medicalized many times over. It's something that we have spent decades trying to control and design and make everybody follow these certain paths. And anybody who sees a lot of birth will tell you that is not how it works at all, right? And so there is something to be said about, are we creating more problems by being so hands-on and by being so involved and trying to control birth so much, right? Most of the time when people go to the hospital, it's because they're sick, right? Birth is one of those things. Birth is not an illness, right?
No.
It is something that's a natural part of being human, and that's something that we can kind of take a look at. But I also really advocate for, you can have a great experience in the hospital, but you do need to be ready to advocate, ready to speak up, armed with education and armed with being able to have those conversations to make sure you do have that empowered birth. I support a lot of hospital births, and I see a lot of amazing births no matter what the outcome is, because that person was ready to speak up, they came with education, and they were ready to make those decisions as they came, right? So even if the outcome wasn't what they wanted or what they were planning, I still see amazing births and people coming out feeling empowered and great and like it was a positive experience.
Wow, that's amazing.
So as much as I love out of hospital, in the hospital, if that's where we feel safest, which is so true for so many people, if that's where you feel safest and you're not going to feel safe out of the hospital, you can be at the hospital. You can definitely be at the hospital. I've met some people where I'm like, oh, I would never. Yeah, you need to be at the hospital,
Yeah.
right? Because that is where they feel so safe and comfortable. And that is going to be such a big part of birth, right? Where do we feel safest? Where do we feel comfortable? Who do we feel comfortable with? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And again, that looks different for every person.
For sure. I mean, even for me, like I have had white coat syndrome with doctors since I was a little girl. So I was like, I go into a hospital, my blood pressure instantly goes through the roof. So like even knowing that about myself and being like, well, if I'm going to go through this really like transformative experience, I don't perceive that as a safe place for me. But I also, like, full disclosure, will admit, like, you know, due to my age and health, you know, there's risk factors there of like, okay, well, I need to take this into consideration when I'm making that, when I'm, you know, one day will be in that decision to make, you know, where is the most optimal place. So I really love that you emphasize the education piece, because that is really where empowerment comes from, is being equipped with that knowledge so that you can make those decisions.
And the one thing that I forgot to say was that midwives are also medical professionals. They go through tons of training. They know what to do if something goes wrong. They know how to resuscitate babies. They know what amount of bleeding is too much bleeding. Like, they know all of those things as well, and they're going to be there if something goes wrong out of the hospital too, right? So that's where, again, they're going to be medical professionals as well. Their expertise is just going to be in autonomous birth, right?
Beautiful.
Birth without, you know, as many interventions is going to be their expertise.
Yeah, let's talk about that autonomous birth concept, because I want to talk all about drugs. I want to talk all about drugs for this next question. So one of the things, you know, I think this is a dichotomous split among the community. For many people, you know, talking about medical intervention by way of certain prenatal and delivery related drugs. So those, can you speak kind of, you know, some people, some women, you know, who participate in natural birth look back and go, that was beautiful. That was also the hardest thing I've ever been through. And then, you know, some people really are like, well, they look at you like you're crazy if you say you want to give a natural birth. They're like, give me everything. And again, I understand, like, to your point, this is a personal decision, but how do you navigate the conversations around that piece of medical intervention?
Yeah. So I explain, you know, most of the time when we're talking about medical, like, pain relief, we're talking about epidurals. About 80% of people who birth in hospitals have an epidural.
Okay.
So it's a pretty high percentage. I describe epidurals as a tool, right? I think that everybody should be prepared to birth unmedicated, because sometimes that happens even when an epidural is our plan.
Right.
I also think that everybody should be prepared for an epidural and what it looks like, right? Because it does sometimes happen. We do sometimes need that tool. If we're going for a cesarean, that's not the number one pain relief that's utilized for cesareans.
Okay.
So I think we need both sides of it. right? We need to be prepared to not have it, and we need to kind of know what it looks like if that does happen, right? When we're trying to decide, it really depends, right? It really depends on what do we want out of this experience for birth. There's a midwife that I once told me, like, she said people are preparing for an unmedicated birth. They're preparing for an experience, and if they aren't ready for that, then it's going to be harder to go through that, right? So if we're not preparing for this experience of what it might feel like and what it might look like and what we might work through in an unmedicated birth, it can be really difficult to get through it, right? But then there's also things that get thrown a wrench in it. Maybe we're 3 days into labor. Maybe we're exhausted. Maybe we've been having back labor, which is, for anybody who doesn't know, most labor contractions happen in the front of the uterus. Sometimes when babies are in wonky positions, people will have back labor. It is so intense. It is not fun. From personal experience, I'll tell you.
Man.
Not fun, right? So sometimes labor goes these different ways you weren't prepared for. And an epidural is a good tool. I've also seen people who go through 3 days of labor and their progress stalls. They get an epidural, they take a nap, and they have a baby 30 minutes later, right? So it really is, I love to look at it as a tool, and we can decide if we want to pull that out of our toolbox, right? And then with epidurals, you know, if that's like our plan to get one, I really highly encourage people to do a couple things. I encourage them to wait as long as they can, right? And maybe we're waiting until we're like 5-6 centimeters, right? That way we've had time for our body to progress and move and shift and, you know, help baby move through. And then maybe we can use that pain relief. That's usually my number one recommendation. And then my second recommendation is that once we have it, we're moving as much as we can, right? So even if that's flipping from side to side, utilizing a hospital bed, that kind of stuff, because that is the one thing that is taken away from us with an epidural is movement, right? So movement and gravity and walking and shifting and squatting and all of these things that we can do in labor really help progress labor, help speed up labor, help move baby through the pelvis. And once we have an epidural, we kind of lose that ability to do that.
Wow. Okay. That's really interesting.
Those are kind of the things I would take into account if I was trying to decide if I wanted an epidural or not.
Yeah. What's the longest labor you've ever bear witness to?
Unmedicated, so like not medically like induced, probably like 2.5, 3 days.
Wow.
And then if it was for an induction, 5 days.
Wow.
So inductions can be very long, but we want them to be long because we're trying to convince our body to do something that it wasn't ready to do. So medical inductions usually use quite a few different medications and things like that to slowly get the body ready into labor. So even though it's not fun to go through like 5 days, it usually is the right thing to get your body ready to go into labor and have your baby.
Yeah, that's really thank you for sharing that. And I think, I think culturally we're conditioned to kind of want to avoid pain, right? Like I think, and especially in the traditional medical model, it's like, schedule my C-section, get me in, get me out, let's go. And I think, what I really hear from your work, and I deeply resonate with it, is like, I look at giving birth as a ceremony. It is ceremonial in a lot of ways. It is like we talked about, an initiation into something bigger than yourself. A new version of your identity is being born in that moment. And I think part of us, just from a societal standpoint, wants to rush through that and control that, going back to our earlier conversation. And I think that for those who are choosing a different way, who are perceiving it more like a ceremonial experience of like, this is something that, I've been preparing my whole life for. I was actually biologically designed to do this. There is so much potency woven into that.
Yeah.
I would imagine.
Yeah. So much potency. And it really is, speaking to control, it's kind of like, how much control do we want to give up, right? Like how much are we willing to do that, right? To birth unmedicated or birth out of the hospital or, things like that. How much are we willing to kind of relinquish to the experience?
Very cool. And it's a personal journey for each and every individual. So I love that there's like, it's choose your own adventure style. And that can be overwhelming, but that also can be incredibly empowering. Kind of in that same vein, I wanted to speak to this point. I have worked a lot with families, and I talk a lot with dads. I want to speak to the dads in the house, or the partners who are not carrying the baby and delivering the baby. How do you support folks in that position? Because I think, again, I love how you kind of pour into your mamas to like help guide them on the journey. But I do, just from like psychological developmental research, there is, when we talk about attachment and attunement to your baby, I feel like for the party who isn't carrying and delivering the baby, they have a lot of catching up to do because they didn't just spend the last 9 months, incubating this precious angel. How do you support those folks in your work?
So, supporting dads, partners, really is a big part of my job, right? In the education side, but also in the doula side. A lot of partners they want to do well. They want to do good so badly, which is very sweet. And I find that sometimes they have a harder time letting go of control more. They want like an answer. They want this is what's going to happen and this is when it's going to happen and this is how I can best support, right? But they don't love when the answer is like, you're going to have to wait and see. You're going to have to be in the moment.
Yeah, right.
So I in my classes, I teach a lot about like, how do we hold space and what does that mean? Because that's something people will say, but like, what does that actually mean?
Right.
And so that means that I'm going to withhold some of what I'm feeling and what I'm experiencing to focus on the person who's giving birth, right? And that could be just in my presence, being close, right? That could be in touch, that could be in massage or words of affirmation. There's so many ways that can look. So we talk about what it's like to hold space. I also have a couple of rules that everybody laughs at, but I'm like, no, like you do need to follow this. And that is that if you are not giving birth, you can't get your feelings hurt. And if you're giving birth, you can't hurt anybody's feelings.
I love that.
So those are like my 2 labor rules, right? Mm-hmm. So that when we go into labor, we're having this conversation of like, the person who's in labor can say what they need to say. They can share how they're feeling. They can share what feels good, what doesn't, right? And they don't have to do that in like the kindest or most gentle way. They're able to just say it, right? And so that usually helps people understand a little bit of like, okay, I'm here to support. And I give, especially in births, I'll be like, I'll hand the cup of water to the partner. I will say, oh, do you need a hand to hold? And like put the partner in that place. Yeah. Or really, very hands-on suggestions. And then the last thing that I do a lot for partners is I really prepare them for like, it can be really hard to see somebody that you love, like in pain, having a hard time, not feeling great. And we need to be okay with that. We need to like sit with that for a little bit and think about like, I'm going to be there to support them, and I'm going to try not to freeze, right? I'm not going to try not to freeze and like pull away from that.
Right.
Because this is when you're with the person, maybe the person you love, or maybe the person you're having a baby with, right, really needs that support and that love.
Wow. How beautiful. Again, just kind of walking alongside folks, because again, from, everyone who goes through this, they're going through it for the first time. And, trying to figure out what feels most aligned for that process. I think that's so powerful. And I think that that other partner who is not going through the labor and delivery of a baby is often forgotten about. And even after birth, like what that looks like as far as like skin to skin and like just getting those things out on the table to talk about, so that both parties can feel really connected and plugged into that experience.
Yeah. So I kind of joke about like, it's my job as a doula to make the partner look really good, you know, because I'm like whispering in their ear a little bit and like, here, go over there, right, you know, and really just empowering them to make sure that like they are still taking care of themselves, right? Like you do need to sleep and you do need to eat, and like someone's gonna have to take care of this baby once it's here, once it's here, and you know, a lot of partners will have a lot of questions about like, okay, what does my role look like afterwards? What does my role look like once baby's here? And again, that's where I really encourage, you know, I have a postpartum like planning guide that essentially asks those questions of like, what kind of parents are we going to be, and what's the split of
Beautiful.
labor, you know, domestic labor going to look like, and stuff like that. But essentially it can look however you want it to look. And even though that's hard for people, again, it's going back into that intuition, going back into that, like, you are the best person to decide that, right? And if we're supporting like a breastfeeding relationship, there's a lot of stuff you can do that is not feeding baby, right? There's a lot of diapers to be changed, and, you know, laundry to be done, and snacks to be made, and things like that, right? It just might look different, right, than what we think like this like perfect 50-50 split might look like.
Yeah, I love that you extended into that aftercare, because I think even in the hospital, like in the more traditional setting, they send you out once you're discharged, and then you're kind of on your own. And I have worked with a lot of families. A lot of birth trauma comes up around that, because, you know, people are having this realization on the drive home from the hospital, oh my God, we have a baby in the backseat of our car and we're parents. And then the whole identity crisis comes into play. And so just that you can usher them through the entirety of that process is, your clients are so lucky to have you. And I feel like most people don't get that. And so, I am just so in awe of the work that you're committed to. And I really, you know, just personally and professionally, I truly believe in empowerment through the pregnancy and birthing process. I think it's, you know, part of my mission to bring more awareness around that to our communities. And so, I just thank you for your work. It's truly amazing. And I was wondering, maybe for our listeners, if you could share a little bit more about any current offerings that you have, a little bit about this education piece, so that folks know where to find you and what are available from you in this time.
Yeah. So I currently take a couple of birth clients a month. So if anybody is looking for birth doula support, the way to do that is just to set up a consult with me, and we have like a little conversation and walk through that. For education, my business is called Dare to Birth, and we offer classes virtually all throughout the Valley, group classes, you know, private offerings, all of that kind of stuff. And we go through as much as we can, right? So we have 4-week classes or 1 day like kind of crash course options, but we go over birth and what it looks like. We go over birth planning, medical interventions. We go deep into postpartum, newborn care, infant feeding, all of that kind of stuff, to really hopefully give like a really well-rounded education and like preparation, right? And so one of the things that I'm really proud of and that sets us apart is that focus on intuition, on that focus of making the decisions that are right for you, not the decisions that I would make for me or that I think are best, right? Really like helping people reflect back onto what's most important to them. So our classes have journal prompts, our classes have meditations at the end of every class, right? Really trying to balance the education and the physical preparation with the mental preparation.
A beautiful
So I have a
merge.
couple of amazing educators who are all experts in their own fields, that really are like, any families who take their classes are so lucky to hear all the things that they have to offer. So you can find all that like on our website and daretobirth.com and our Instagram at daretobirth.
Amazing. And I'll be sure to link all that in our show notes so that folks can connect with you nice and easily. Alex Barr, Dare to Birth, thank you so much for being here today and sharing this really important topic with our community. We are so grateful for you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. All right. Well, thank you to our listeners for tuning in to another episode of the Trust Your Gut podcast. I can't wait to see you on the next one.